Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. It's early February 2025, and let's talk about economic crashes. This is a topic we have been discussing for, I think, a little over a year, because the US economy and to some extent the world economy has been in a crazy bubble with, in my opinion, many similarities to the 2008 situation, or, the run-up to that, which resulted in the 2008 situation. And from a socialist standpoint, we know that there was a lot of questioning of capitalism that occurred in the wake of the 2008 global financial crisis, and there's probably going to be a lot more after the next crash. These crashes are an inherent feature of capitalism. They can try to mitigate them, but it is a part of the system for reasons we're going to discuss and which Marx described way back in the 1840s. And our overall framing for this video is as a response to another video called Trump Wants a Crash to Benefit the Ultra Wealthy, dating from about 2 months ago. So yeah, Donald Trump is president now. That sucks. So far, he has been serving as a sock puppet for Elon Musk and a bunch of other extreme right tech bro crazies that plan to buy Greenland, for example. That's part of a Peter Thiel associated PayPal mafia thing. It's a bit convoluted, but basically there's this thing called Praxis, which Peter Thiel has backed. They're trying to make a, quote, network state country which runs on crypto, and apparently they want Greenland for the actual physical land base. So it's hard to tell at this point what coming out of Trump is even Trump. Seems like very little. Anyway, as regards an economic crash, again, these are periodic. They just occur normally within capitalism because of the contradictions within the system. And there have been a number of signs of a big one on the horizon for literally years now. Now, you could avoid this by increasing wages, although that's not in the class interest of the capitalists who run the system. You could get it anyway with a strong enough labor movement. But we don't have a strong enough labor movement. In fact, the labor movement has been in decline for at least a half century. So let's go ahead and get into this video, and we'll get into a lot more specifics of the limitations of the capitalist or bourgeois economic analysis that this guy, Richard J. Murphy, is doing. He's not all wrong, but by refusing to go beyond looking at the system from the perspective that capitalism has a finite lifespan and will cease to exist, well, because of that, there are a number of things that he is overlooking, which we're going to discuss. Let's begin.
Can the world economy crash? The answer is that, yes, of course it can. We know it can. It did in 2008. It had another very good go in 2020 when COVID came along. So the possibility that the world economy can crash is obviously hardwired within it. It is now something that we have to accept.
So that's definitely not the choice of phrasing I would have used. It's something we have to accept. And then there's like a real note of finality there. Yes, it is a feature of capitalism. No, capitalism is not the only economic system which can run an advanced industrialized society. Capitalism is when the capitalist class rules the advanced industrialized society. Socialism is when the working class runs the advanced industrialized society and then can build a future advanced industrialized society, which capitalists cannot do because they are locked into profit making and trying to exploit the overwhelming majority of the population. This precarious position that they as a class are in is actually what causes these crises of overproduction in the first place. Murphy has given a couple of recent examples like 2008 and 2020 when a precarious economy was sent over the tipping point by some economic stressor. But let's go back now to late 1847. Friedrich Engels, Principles of Communism. Point 12. What were the further consequences of the Industrial Revolution? Big industry created in the steam engine and other machines the means of endlessly expanding industrial production, speeding it up and cutting its costs. With production thus facilitated, the free competition, which is necessarily bound up with big industry, assumed the most extreme forms. A multitude of capitalists invaded industry, and in a short while, more was produced than was needed. As a consequence, finished commodities, which are goods or services produced for exchange, could not be sold, and a so-called commercial crisis broke out. Factories had to be closed, their owners went bankrupt, and the workers were without bread. Deepest misery reigned everywhere. And commenting, this was a brand new feature in human society. Literally up to this point, this had never been the case. However, with mass mechanized production, we were actually overcoming scarcity, potentially completely. Except what? The workers weren't being paid enough to consume all this stuff. I mean, there's a certain amount of stuff that you just don't need and wouldn't buy. But the basic situation in capitalism is that capitalists want to keep as much profit for themselves as possible and pay the lowest wages that they can manage to do. And the reality is that workers don't get paid enough to absorb the flood of commodities hitting the market. Instead, we just get paid enough basically to survive. All the more so at that point because mass-scale labor struggles and the struggle for socialism had not really begun in earnest. And now in our quote-unquote post-socialist world, we are rapidly headed back toward the greatly decreased living standards of those old times. At least that's what the capitalists would like to return us to. Anyway, so if the commodities produced couldn't be bought, then production was shut down. In other words, a recession. People were laid off, factories were closed, workers struggled to come up with the money that they needed to buy basic necessities. Then what happened? Continuing with Engels, after a time, the extra products were sold, the factories began to operate again, wages rose, and gradually business got better than ever. But it was not long before too many commodities were again produced, and a new crisis broke out, only to follow the same course as its predecessor. Ever since the beginning of the 19th century, the condition of industry has constantly fluctuated between periods of prosperity and periods of crisis. Nearly every 5 to 7 years, a fresh crisis has intervened, always with the greatest hardship for workers, and always accompanied by general revolutionary stirrings and the direct peril to the whole existing order of things. Basically, capitalist society was being shaken to its foundation. And although Murphy is just talking about recent examples like 2008, well, you can look at the crash of 1929 and the Great Depression that followed that. The USSR was then existing, and it didn't get dragged down because it was using a planned economy, while the capitalist world was torn apart by that crash, and the capitalist government started doing fascism, both vainly to try to shore up the economy and to repress the workers who were saying, hey, enough of this system. For more on that, we have a great audiobook on this channel called Fascism and Social Revolution by Rajani P. Dutt, D-U-T-T. I highly recommend checking that out. It's quite long, about 13 hours in total, but it is vital reading for anyone who considers themselves on the left or anti-capitalist or whatever. We'll get back to Murphy in just a second, but let's continue with Engels on one more point. Number 13, what follows from these periodic commercial crises? First, that though big industry in its earliest stage created free competition, it is now, that is, as of the 1840s, outgrown free competition. In other words, the winners were getting big enough that they were getting really established, and then this process was said to become a second stage of capitalism, advanced monopoly capitalism, or imperialism, as described by Lenin in works such as Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. Imperialism in that sense really came into its own in the 20th century. Continuing, that for big industry, competition, and generally the individualistic organization of production have become a fetter, a restraint, which it must and will shatter. That, so long as big industry remains on its present footing, it can be maintained only at the cost of general chaos every 7 years, each time threatening the whole of civilization and not only plunging the proletarians into misery, but also ruining large sections of the bourgeoisie, or capitalists. Hence, either that big industry must itself be given up, which is an absolute impossibility, or that it makes unavoidably necessary an entirely new organization of society in which production is no longer directed by mutually competing individual industrialists, but rather by the whole society operating according to a definite plan and taking account of the needs of all. Second, that big industry and the limitless expansion of production which it makes possible bring within the range of feasibility a social order in which so much is produced that every member of society will be in a position to exercise and develop all their powers and faculties in complete freedom. It thus appears that the very qualities of big industry which, in our present-day society, produce misery and crises because of class contradictions, are those which in a different form of society will abolish this misery and these catastrophic depressions. We see with the greatest clarity, 1, that all these evils are from now on to be ascribed solely to a social order which no longer corresponds to the requirements of the real situation, and 2, that it is possible through a new social order to do away with these evils altogether. Engels then says, what will this new social order have to be like? And basically it will have to be founded on the abolition of private property, meaning bourgeois property, the private ownership of productive equipment, and instead the common utilization of all instruments of production and the distribution of all products according to common agreement. In other words, the communal ownership of goods. So, in other words, we get these economic crashes because capitalism is overcoming scarcity, but then has to rein it back in to maintain scarcity. Why? Because without that, capitalists can't stay in charge and keep profiting. That's really it. Recessions are the price of capitalists staying in charge, and they know that. They try to confuse you about it, and a few of them even lose perspective of their own scam and start believing their own lies once in a while. But basically, they would rather do fascism every single time than give up the system, which, yes, crashes every so often, but it's the only way that they can stay in this ridiculous amount of wealth on a private, personal basis at our expense. So, do we have to just accept that the economy is going to keep crashing forever? Well, capitalism will, but capitalism also isn't the end of the road as far as social and economic development. Engels goes on to explain in point 20 what will be the consequences of the ultimate disappearance of private property, that society will take all forces of production and means of commerce, as well as the exchange and distribution of products, out of the hands of private capitalists, and will manage them in accordance with a plan based on the availability of resources and the needs of the whole society. In this way, most important of all, the evil consequences which are now associated with the conduct of big industry will be abolished. There will be no more crises. The expanded production, this is important, which for the present order of society, meaning capitalism, is overproduction and hence a prevailing cause of misery, will then, in socialism, be insufficient and in need of being expanded much further. Instead of generating misery, overproduction in socialism will reach beyond the elementary requirements of society to assure the satisfaction of the needs of all. It will create new needs and at the same time the means of satisfying them. It will become the condition of, and the stimulus to, new progress, which will no longer throw the whole social order into confusion, as progress has always done in the past. Big industry, freed from the pressure of private property, will undergo such an expansion that what we now see will seem as petty in comparison as manufacture seems when put beside the big industry of our own day. This development of industry will make available to society a sufficient mass of products to satisfy the needs of everyone. So leaving aside Engels for a minute, think about where we are in the history of industrial production. We now have AI, brand new last couple of years. We now have one foot fully in the world of extremely high-tech production, and the other one is on its way. We're stepping into that future now. We're stepping into a world where production is so greatly expanded that these crises are going to be terrifically huge. Basically, everybody's wondering, who's going to need to work when machines can just do all of this. Something Marx described a century and a half ago when he explained why the rate of profit tends to go down over time towards zero, creating a final crisis from which capitalism cannot recover. And yeah, there's always going to be some jobs that machines can't do, etc. That's not really the point, and I think that people diverting onto that are really missing the point, which is now, using machines, a single worker or a very small team of workers can create a mountain of value. The only way to make that situation work for the majority of the population is to get rid of capitalism, remove the capitalists from power, abolish private property, and operate industry according to a common plan to meet human need. There are a lot of nightmare scenarios going around imagining depopulation and what are the capitalists going to do once they don't need us anymore? Well, we don't need them. We can remove them from their place as capitalists. They can get a job and live alongside the rest of us. In other words, when we have an anti-communist mindset, we think that capitalism is just going to go on forever. That's where you start thinking of these scenarios because, yeah, capitalists have been incredibly violent in trying to hang on to power. And as their system goes into more and more violent convulsions, and we still try to have this system where you work for a capitalist in order to get money to buy basic necessities. I mean, yeah, the recognition that those things are not compatible is accurate, and the solution is to end the class dynamics that produce that situation in the first place. End capitalism, create a worker-centric, worker-run society. Make this stuff work for us, and you get rid of the economic crises, which in capitalism are just a product of capitalists shutting down production to protect prices and profits in their own interest against the interest of the overwhelming majority of the rest of the human race. Okay, with that as background, let's proceed.
Is the possibility that the world economy will crash soon a realistic likelihood? And my answer to that is yes, it almost certainly is. And the reason why comes down to two words: Donald Trump.
Okay, so that's a really ridiculous oversimplification. The global capitalist economy, led by the US, was going to crash with or without Donald Trump. There have been indicators of this for years. One of them is the inverted bond yield curve. This is when short-term bonds, like 2 years, start to outperform longer-term bonds like 10 years, indicating a lack of capitalist or investor confidence in the medium-term security of the economy. So normally, due to the time value of money, a longer-term investment, like a 10-year bond, would pay better because it's tying up your money for a longer period of time than a 2-year bond. Why? Because you're getting that money back faster. So when this flips or inverts, it means that something is awry. And when it uninverts later, that is usually a sign that a recession is right around the corner if it hasn't started already. In our case, the bond yield curve uninverted back in August. And typically it's just a matter of months from the point when the uninversion happens or it goes back to a normal scenario and a recession shows up clearly. Mass layoffs, economic contraction, etc. So we're due for one anyway. Basically all it needs is some kind of a shock, like for example DeepSeek coming out, a new AI model which can do basically everything that OpenAI can do, but without the expensive chips which were a major part of the AI-driven stock bubble. Basically all the capitalists were like, AI is here, it's going to save the economy, lead to all this productivity, we can lower wages, etc., profits, profits, profits. And what do you mean you don't need to buy our $40,000 GPU chips? Uh-oh. So that just happened really recently. Some countries like Italy have responded by banning the DeepSeek thing. Again, it's like competition is great, except, for national security reasons, meaning it's going to pop this bubble that they've carefully crafted. So that definitely counts as an economic shock. Trump's tariffs, wild tariffs. I mean, he was just going through the negotiations on the Canada, Mexico, and China ones. But now he's also been threatening, actually since the fall, up to 100% tariffs if BRICS makes its own currency, which again, the last time that we covered that wasn't really in the works immediately because the larger countries like Russia, China, and India really couldn't agree on what the basis for that currency would be. But whether or not that's right around the corner, the point is that the US economy is under major stress. And when I say the US economy, I mean the US and everything else that is tied to it, which is a lot of stuff because the dollar is used as a global reserve currency. And, that might not make sense anymore. None of which, by the way, has to do with socialism, but even just this competition between large capitalist blocs, which we call inter-imperialist competition, can lead to a world war. So major shakeups. Yet another reason. I mean, do you want a world war? I don't. Why we need to end this system. But anyway, trying to blame this on Trump, like it was bound to happen. The curve just uninverted a number of months ago. And although they've been talking about the possibility of a, quote, soft landing, I mean, that's very unlikely, with or without Trump, because what normally happens is the duration of the yield curve inversion corresponds to the depth of the crash. In other words, the longer that the bond yield curve stays inverted, when it uninverts and there is a recession, the deeper that the recession generally is. And this recent yield curve inversion was one of the longest on record, on par with 2008, the one in the mid-70s, and the one before the Great Depression. Another factor is the financialization of the economy and speculation. So historically, the main type of economic activity has been the production of goods and to a lesser extent, services. Below that has been financial product creation. So financial services, financial instruments, and so forth, which can be a source of profit. After the early 1970s, with the US going off of the gold standard and the general beginning of the neoliberal period, financial services started making up a bigger and bigger share of US GDP. The term casino economy emerged after the 2008 crisis when knowledge became more public that there were bets on bets on bets within the financial sector and that this had played a role in the 2008 crash. This was also closely tied to speculation in the housing market, which is going on again today. Single-family housing has been bought up by the tens of thousands by large capital firms and basically just held for ransom for years on end. This has driven up prices to completely unsustainable levels, and eventually this is going to give out. The bubble, or widespread overvaluation due to these basically price manipulations, will pop, and who knows what it's going to take down with it when it goes. So these are systemic things. It doesn't have to do with Donald Trump. Now, a lot of the rich people backing Donald Trump are invested in this bubble in ways that they're going to try to get rich off of when it pops, of course. But what we're actually looking at here is a much bigger systemic problem of which Donald Trump and Praxis and Peter Thiel, etc., are all just a facet. Let's continue.
Trump has set out to crash the world economy. I really don't think there's much doubt about that. He has declared trade war, and he has said that he will also impose economic sanctions on countries that refuse to use the dollar for trade. He is, in other words, setting out to undermine the credibility of the world's reserve currency, the dollar, by threatening any country that does not want to use it. And he is threatening that any country that wants to take sanction against the US because it is going to impose sanctions on them via tariffs is going to suffer as a consequence.
Okay, I may have been giving this guy a little or a lot too much credit. As far as Trump's intentions go, he's actually trying to do the opposite of most of what was just mentioned. And I think that a lot of the misunderstanding on this person's part, from my perspective, is that the global reserve currency is not the global reserve currency because people just believe in it. It is an instrument of U.S. imperialist hegemony, and the U.S. and its allies have used force many times to make it that and to keep it that. I say force, and I do mean military force. There are times where they do overt military interventions, but there's also a lot of covert actions as well, and soft, more diplomatic manipulations in order to keep the US in that top slot. So it's really quite a take to say that Trump is out to undermine the credibility of the US. No, he's trying to protect the US. So, like under George W. Bush, for example, in the Bush-Cheney years in the 2000s, the world saw the US burning a lot of its goodwill as it undertook the global war on terror. Why did it do that? Were Bush and Cheney just bad people? If so, why did the Democrats basically uphold, not just at the time by supporting it, but afterward when they were in power, those policies and the overall policy framework, the meta war of the global war on terror and everything that went with that? Well, I would say that they did it because they had to. Of course, you want to use soft power wherever you can. You want people to just do what you say because they like you, because you're the best ally that there is, because there's mutual benefit, and so on. But that's not the way that the US works. And as we went into the 21st century, the US really had to go more mask off and get a lot more aggressive if it was going to stay on top in the 21st century. And that's basically still the playbook. So Trump is not new. Trump is not unique. Trump is the latest evolution of that basic paradigm. And the Democrats can swear up, down, and sideways that they disagree with it, but this is superficial. They fundamentally are on the same page because their party is beholden to the exact same interests. Remember, the Democratic Party has been in power since 1828. They're not opposition. They built the system too. Any resistance that they do is shallow, performative, and basically just to try to fool you. The reality is that their main function is as an ally of the Republican Party to block the left from actually challenging U.S. imperialism at a more fundamental level. That's why the Democrats have overseen the hollowing out of the labor movement and so many other facets of the fascization of the United States. People will point out that, the Peter Thiels are more involved with the Republican Party. Yes, and the Democrats run cover for them. What is confusing here? They keep themselves clean enough that they can look credibly to you, clearly it's working, like opposition. But they're controlled opposition. Extremely ineffective on purpose opposition. So anyway, this Trump is trying to undermine the credibility of the global reserve currency. I guess why? Because Putin or something? These are just... you see it on social media, the whole Trump is in Putin's pocket and whatever. When are you going to start understanding global class dynamics here? Imperialism is a global system. Yes, there is inter-imperialist conflict, and they will fight world wars over it. But at the same time, they have to be very careful that their class infighting and their quest for a larger share of the global profits pie doesn't upset the whole apple cart. They need to keep a grip on the global working class and maintain capitalism. A great example of how a very militant, well-organized communist movement exploited a moment of inter-imperialist infighting was World War I and the Russian Revolution. Basically, Lenin said that in order to end this war, multiple countries would have to go socialist, thus pulling out of the inter-imperialist fight. Are we in a position to do that now? Do we have the organization? Do we have the mass movement? Well, we need to build it. But anyway, so Trump is making all these threats. Why? Because it's what the U.S. system requires. This isn't an aberration. It's just an emergency. It's the same system, just acting more desperately to do what it always has tried to do. The basic logic underlying the system is not complex. All right, so we've already diverged quite a bit. Let's resume the video.
You cannot do that if you are the world's major economic power and not give rise to the likelihood of an economic crash. Simple, straightforward, fact. So, should we be worried about this? Well, yes, of course we should be. But what is the consequence going to be? And why is Donald Trump not worried about this?
Okay, so he's about to give his answer to why Trump is not worried about this, but I would actually counter that Trump does seem worried. Making all these threats, the lunatic fascist paranoia, these are kind of like the last lines of defense of the capitalist system. Biden teed it up, and Trump is now taking it to the hole. So we're going to talk about quantitative easing, which is the basis for this guy's conspiracy theory about how Trump is, acting unilaterally to crash the world economy.
And the answer to that is that I'm afraid to say that something has also become hardwired into the world economy. In 2008 and in 2020, the world was saved with bailout money. In 2008, quantitative easing became a feature of economic life. Before then, the possibility that the government would issue bonds to immediately repurchase them to pretend that it wasn't actually providing direct finance to itself from its central bank to fund its programs to ensure that the economy kept going was unknown. But that is what QE did in 2008. And let's be honest, despite all the problems it gave rise to, and it should not have been done in the way that it was, it did keep economies going during that crisis.
Yeah, so they did do quantitative easing, dumping huge amounts of money into the economy to keep it going because they had to. And yes, it did work. It got the economy going again along capitalist lines. So huge amounts of inequality growing and growing, a much bigger recovery for the rich than for everybody else, and the creation of a more precarious situation looming in the future. So I don't know how it should have been done according to this guy. He doesn't say, so I can't respond to that. But it is what they decided they needed to do. It was a new technique doing these reserves, which, as we've discussed in prior videos and live streams, they haven't been able to get out of since they started doing it. I put a chart on the screen of these reserves, and they just keep growing and growing. Every time that they try to ratchet them down, something in the economy tends to break. So this seems to be kind of like a one-way street that may lead to that final crisis, which will just see the system kind of break down and then limp along until it's finally exterminated, causing a lot of misery in the process. So, okay, we agree QE did help save the economy at the price of creating new future problems, but what else?
And it did exactly the same again in 2020. Again, I would not have done it as the QE program was managed, and the aftermath of that program, the Quantitative Tightening program now being run by the Bank of England, is completely disastrous and was in fact the main cause for the crash during Liz Truss's short premiership. But the fact is that the government's ability to create money to support a program during an economic crash was proved for the second time in a little over a decade to be fundamental to keeping the world economy going.
So those comments were basically along the same lines. I just wanted to interject that quantitative tightening was not the cause of the crash during Liz Truss's term. Capitalism was the cause for it. Because why? The quantitative tightening is part of a system which was put in place after 2008 as part of a global financial emergency. So they tried scaling back the emergency protective measures and it crashed again. So we agree on those facts, but I think I would interpret this a little bit differently in that you have an economic system which can't stop crashing unless you were dumping in huge amounts of money to it in a way that was never really required prior to 2008. So we could say that the patient is not really responding to conventional treatments anymore, and so more extreme measures are required, and as soon as they're let up, the same problems resurface. But, the lack of painkillers isn't the source of the pain. Something else is an underlying cause. Resuming.
So what is Trump doing? He's relying on another bailout. That, I am sure, is what underpins his thinking and that of those who are following him. What they know is that those two bailouts structured as they were incredibly good for their own financial well-being. They probably weren't great for your financial well-being because wages have in effect flatlined since 2008. GDP growth has flatlined since 2008. And since 2020, very large numbers of people have not been able to work who previously did for all sorts of reasons as a consequence of the fallout from COVID. And we most certainly have not been seeing growth, and we are seeing austerity again. So for lots of reasons, most people in the world have suffered since 2008. But Trump and his cohort haven't. That cohort is the world's wealthy. And they did immensely well out of quantitative easing, because the way in which it was structured was to provide funds to the City of London, to the banking arrangements of New York, and to the bankers of Frankfurt, and they used that money to basically inflate the value of the world's financial assets.
I again would like to rephrase. So the title of this video is Trump Wants a Crash to Benefit the Ultra-Wealthy. So Trump is among the ultra-wealthy. And yes, the ultra-wealthy have opposed class interests to everyone else. So that is very much a they win, you lose, and vice versa situation. So that's something that they have to stay on top of. And there was a huge amount of writing on the wall that another crash was coming. And so, of course, they're trying to stay on top of that and make sure that their interests and not ours come out on top. So I think that the title was written to be taken as Trump wants a crash that otherwise wouldn't have happened in order to benefit the ultra-wealthy. But I would take the same title and just look at it a little differently, and it'll still stay valid. Trump wants a crash, which was going to happen anyway, to benefit the ultra-wealthy, because those are his people. And whatever happens in class society, they want it to benefit their class. Do you see the difference? One has Trump doing the crash intentionally as part of a conspiracy of Trump and his cohort, and one accurately sees crashes as an inherent part of capitalism, inseparable from the system itself. The very same system, by the way, that produces billionaires in the first place. There are not billionaires in socialism. People become billionaires because they own privately the means of production and operate them as capital, which is to say resources deployed as a social weapon to exploit labor for profit. So Murphy says that the world's wealthy did very well out of the post-2008 recovery of capitalism, which specifically took the form of quantitative easing. And yeah, of course they did, because capitalism is always good for the ultra-wealthy. That's like what it is, man. Like that's what it does. That's capitalism. They wouldn't keep mass slaughtering people around the world to protect it if it didn't do that. So anyway, the liberal mind at work. But the point here is not to just dunk and have a laugh. It's really to show that bourgeois analysis that just has all of these assumptions about the indefinite lifespan of capitalism, etc., they turn blind eyes to a lot of the features of the system, and then they start ascribing them to individuals. You have to take a broader view of the system in the context of overall historical and social development. This is something Marxists refer to as historical materialism. Let's continue.
Stock markets have increased in value since 2008, unsurprisingly, because lots of money, whole walls of money, have flooded in their direction. Commercial property prices have increased. Domestic property prices have increased. Anything which has no productive value in itself. Because let's be clear, shares are not actually a productive asset, they're a financial asset, and most commercial property is not in the sense that I'm talking about a productive asset, because it is used for speculative purposes. And the increase in the value of our properties is not productive in the sense that very large numbers of young people are being excluded from home ownership and the security that it provides as a result. But there's been no increase, therefore, in productive investment. But the value of assets used for speculative purposes by the wealthy has gone through the roof.
Okay, for the purposes of this critique, we will agree with the basic reasoning here. I don't have the figures on productive investment versus speculative investment. I think that would be beyond the scope of this short reaction video to pull together all those figures. But I agree with Murphy that there is a large bubble which is being driven by speculation, hoarding, and that housing is a glaring example of this, just like it was in 2005, 6, and 7. And as a brief aside there, that bubble is already in the process of popping. In the Sun Belt, in Texas, in Florida, and other areas of the southern U.S., we already see some of the largest property investors, by which I mean capital funds that are buying up, 50,000 personal houses, single-family homes, that they bought up a number of years ago and have been holding for ransom at crazy prices. Now starting to offload some of those at 20, 25, 30% losses. It is regional so far, and it's kind of just beginning, but it does look like 2025 is going to be the year that bubble pops. Where it goes once it does, who knows? Because before 2008, they didn't really do this massive reserve system. Who knows what they're going to come up with this time to try to preserve the capitalist private property system. And that is against you and me, who do not have an interest in perpetuating that system.
And what does Trump expect if he creates another world financial crisis? He believes there will be a bailout.
Okay, well, he would probably be right, but he is not creating that crisis. That crisis is coming, as it always does in capitalism, again, unless a strong labor movement, workers' movement, is able to build mass pressure and build political power to get wage increases and overcome the capitalist-enforced gap between productivity and consumption. But yeah, failing that, there probably will be more quantitative easing. I mean, yeah, we could call it another bailout, but really there's just been one ongoing bailout ever since 2008. They can't really seem to figure out how to get the money back out again. Jerome Powell, the head of the Federal Reserve Bank, announced that they were ending quantitative tightening not long ago. They somehow have gotten away with a rather large round of quantitative tightening without anything overtly breaking. Like, a lot of what people are expecting to see go next are small and medium banks, but there hasn't been a big wave of that yet, so I guess they are deciding not to press their luck and just calling it good for now. Continuing.
And he believes that he and his cohort, the world's wealthy, will benefit from there being vastly more money in circulation with very little to use it on except the inflation in the value of the assets that they own. That is what he's banking on. This is literally, I think, his economic policy. This is what he expects as a consequence of his trade wars. He doesn't care that we suffer. He won't care about the countries in the developing world. The vast majority of countries in the world, in fact, who have their debts denominated in dollars, who will suffer enormously as a result of their struggle to find the means to repay those debts, as, for the time being, the dollar is inflated in value and interest rates are too high.
Yeah, Trump doesn't care about that, just like no capitalist cares about that. The entire capitalist system is based on exploiting labor for private gain. That's literally what the whole system is about. Anyone standing up for the system, that's what they're interested in. Trump is not unusual in that sense. He may have a more brash style of going after it, but that is exactly what capitalism is about.
He won't care that people are thrown out of work. All he cares about is the inflation in asset values. And that is what the whole of the world economy is now geared to create for the benefit of a few at cost to the vast majority. Trump's economic policy makes sense if you see it in this way. He runs a bailout economic strategy that is going to work for him and his friends because it will result, when the world economy crashes, in yet more money being made available through the central banking system to inflate the value of the assets that they own. And they'll say, thank you very much, we did very nicely out of that. When can we have another crash?
Well, again, I'm not sure they're asking for a crash. Like, crashes happen. I'll put the chart back up. Here's a chart. The shaded areas are recessions. Any capitalist investor knows how to protect their assets during those. Like, there's strategies for what to do with your investments during boom times, and there's strategies for what to do with your investments during crashes. What there isn't a strategy for is labor to survive these things, because we get thrown out of work, and the only commodity that we have is our labor power. If we can't sell our labor power to a capitalist because nobody's hiring and production is temporarily shut down, then we suffer. But absolutely none of this is unique to Trump. It's part of a system that came into existence a few centuries ago, didn't exist before that, and will, through the combined efforts of the working population of the world, leave existence in the relatively near future, from a historical perspective. So what I hear here is Trump, 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 Trump. But the impending crash is A, simply a feature of capitalism, and B, has been building for years. If we want to talk about something unique to Trump, then dig into the far-right networks that are backing him and prepare and organize for whatever specific conditions can be expected under a Trump presidency or just really from now on. But it's really misleading to try to tell people that you can have capitalism without the eventual Trump. This system, due to its own internal contradictions, which are unavoidable, will run its course and expire. The more conscious of this that it becomes, the more it's going to try to take emergency measures to defend and extend its life. It is up to the global working class to build our class consciousness and organize for the political power we need to confront it, defeat it, and to build socialism to replace it.